Inside a $2 billion factory, the young CEO looked at the new maintenance worker with cold, appraising eyes, then laughed out loud when she saw the rusted, battered toolbox he carried under one arm. She asked him, in front of everyone, whether he actually believed he could repair a $10 million production line with a pile of scrap metal like that. The control room erupted in laughter, engineers turning to smirk at one another, some shaking their heads at the absurdity of it. The man said nothing. He simply looked at her for a moment, then closed the lid of his toolbox and walked away without another word. 16 hours later, the entire main production line stopped without warning, and every alarm in the building began to scream at once. The most expensive experts in the country flew in within hours, and every single one of them failed. When the losses climbed past $12 million an hour, the same woman who had mocked him was forced to walk across the factory floor, stand in front of the man and his old toolbox, and say words she never imagined she would ever have to say. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please save my factory." The factory itself sprawled across nearly 200 acres on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city. A gleaming complex of steel and glass that had become something of a local legend, praised in business magazines as a model of modern manufacturing efficiency. Investors flew in from across the country to tour its automated lines, marveling at robotic arms that moved with surgical precision and artificial intelligence systems that promised to eliminate human error entirely. Amelia had personally overseen much of that transformation, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into upgrades that turned an aging plant into a symbol of what industry could become in the modern age. She believed, with the kind of conviction that only comes from repeated success, that the future belonged entirely to those willing to trust machines over instinct. It was a belief that had served her well for years, right up until the night it very nearly cost her everything she had built. Amelia Carter had built her reputation on being the youngest chief executive in the history of Holloway Industrial, a woman who trusted numbers over instinct and algorithms over experience. At 38 years old, she had already turned a struggling manufacturing company into a $2 billion operation through sheer will and an unshakable belief that technology could solve any problem given enough capital. She wore tailored suits on the factory floor, carried a tablet instead of a clipboard, and measured every decision against dashboards glowing with real-time data. She had little patience for anything she considered outdated, and even less patience for people who reminded her of a slower, older way of doing business. Her engineers respected her, some feared her, and almost everyone assumed that whatever she decided was correct, because she was rarely wrong. And when she was wrong, she rarely admitted it. Daniel Brooks arrived at the gates of the factory on a gray autumn morning. The kind of morning where a light drizzle clings to everything and refuses to become real rain. He was 40 years old, a widower who had spent the better part of 2 decades raising his son alone after losing his wife. And now that his son had grown and moved away to study in another state, Daniel lived quietly by himself, working with his hands the way he always had. He wore a faded flannel jacket and boots that had clearly seen years of oil and grease, and he carried a toolbox that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on a modern factory floor. He had come to accept a short-term contract in mechanical maintenance. Nothing glamorous, nothing permanent. Just steady work for a steady man. From the very first glance, Amelia decided he was a relic of an earlier era, a man who did not belong among her gleaming machines and her army of young engineers with degrees from top universities. His years since his wife's passing had taught him a kind of quiet endurance that few people around him ever noticed, let alone understood. Because grief had never made him bitter, only patient in a way that seemed almost unnatural to those who had not lived through something similar. He had turned down steadier, higher-paying positions in other cities over the years, preferring instead to stay close to the modest house he had shared with his wife, the one his son still called home whenever he returned for the holidays. Money had never driven him the way it drove most people in his industry, and colleagues from earlier chapters of his career sometimes joked, not unkindly, that Daniel seemed to measure his life in the sound of a well-tuned engine rather than in the size of his paycheck. He had taken this particular contract because the plant was close, the hours were steady, and he had grown tired. In recent years, of chasing prestige he no longer cared to have. Nothing about his quiet arrival that morning suggested he was walking back into a building that had, 20 years earlier, been shaped in part by his own two hands. The younger staff picked up on her disdain immediately. The way people always do, when they sense which way the wind is blowing from the top. They laughed along when she made her comment about his tools, some of them exchanging glances that said everything their mouths did not need to. Daniel did not flinch, did not argue, did not even change his expression. He simply turned his attention toward the machines around him, walking slowly along the length of the production line, listening in a way that none of the engineers with their laptops and sensors seemed to be listening. He placed a hand against the housing of one of the massive drive motors, closed his eyes for a moment, and said nothing else for the rest of that first day. Only as he was leaving, almost to himself, did he murmur that the machine sounded sick, that something beneath the surface was already going wrong. Nobody in the room believed him, and nobody thought to ask him what he meant. 3 days into his contract, Amelia decided to make a spectacle of him in front of the senior engineering staff, partly to establish dominance, and partly because she genuinely believed the exercise would prove her right. She called for a full inspection of the main line, a formal walkthrough where every department head would be present, and she invited Daniel to participate so that everyone could witness exactly how far out of his depth he was. When Daniel suggested they shut the line down for 4 hours to run a proper diagnostic by hand, Amelia refused outright, telling him that a $2 billion operation did not pause for guesswork. One of her senior engineers, a sharp-tongued young man named Mark Ellison, could not resist adding his own commentary, joking that if they relied on rusty wrenches instead of real diagnostic equipment, the repair would not be finished until the following year. The room broke into laughter again, Amelia included, and for a moment the mockery felt almost like a team-building exercise. A shared joke at the expense of the outsider who did not fit in. Daniel did not argue with any of them. He simply took out a small notebook, the kind with a worn leather cover that had clearly traveled with him for years, and began writing something down in quiet, careful handwriting. When the meeting ended, he closed the notebook, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and left the control room without a single word of protest. Some of the younger staff found his silence unsettling in a way they could not quite explain, the kind of quiet that did not feel like defeat but felt instead like patience. A few of them began to wonder, quietly among themselves, why a man who had just been humiliated in front of an entire department seemed so entirely unbothered by it. Nobody had an answer, and nobody thought the question was important enough to pursue any further. Not yet. That evening, one of the younger technicians, a woman named Grace Whitman, who had said little during the meeting, found Daniel checking the tension on a conveyor belt long after his shift should have ended. She asked him, out of genuine curiosity rather than mockery, why he bothered staying late when nobody else believed anything was wrong with the machines. Daniel told her, simply, that machines rarely lied about their condition, even when the people running them chose not to listen, and that the low, uneven hum coming from the eastern section of the line had been bothering him since his very first hour on the job. Grace admitted she had noticed something similar weeks earlier, but had dismissed it after the automated diagnostics reported nothing unusual, trusting the software over her own instincts the way she had been trained to. Daniel simply nodded, telling her that instincts built from watching and listening were often the first thing a machine would warn you about, long before any sensor caught up to the problem. She walked away from that conversation with a strange, uneasy feeling she could not quite shake, one that would return to her in a very different form less than 2 days later. The trouble began just after midnight. In the dead hours when the factory ran on a skeleton crew and most of the executives were long gone for the day, production line number 1 shuddered once, twice, and then went completely silent. The massive robotic arms freezing mid-motion, as though some invisible hand had reached in and stopped time itself. Within minutes, production line number 2 followed, an unrelated system on the opposite side of the building failing in a way that made no logical sense to anyone watching the monitors. The automated systems flooded the network with error codes that contradicted one another. Robots reporting phantom obstructions. Sensors reporting values that fluctuated wildly for no discernible reason. The artificial intelligence system that Amelia had spent millions installing, the very system she had bragged about to investors as the future of manufacturing, could not identify a single root cause. It offered dozens of possible explanations and confirmed none of them, cycling through diagnostic loops that led nowhere. By early morning, the company had flown in specialists from the original equipment manufacturer, engineers who had built the very systems now failing, along with consultants who charged more per hour than most people earned in a month. They replaced sensors one after another, swapped out programmable logic controllers, installed new motors on the sections most likely to be at fault, and even brought in fresh servers in case the failure was buried somewhere in the software itself. None of it worked. The line would flicker to life for a few minutes, run erratically, and then collapse again into silence, as though the entire system were mocking their efforts. The losses were staggering, climbing past $12 million for every hour the factory sat idle, a number that appeared on Amelia's screen in red letters that seemed to grow larger every time she looked at it. She paced the length of the control room, her composure cracking for the first time in years, while somewhere in the building, in the quiet of the employee break room, Daniel Brooks sat alone with a cup of black coffee, waiting. Phones rang constantly throughout the building that night. Board members demanding updates, major clients threatening to pull contracts if shipments were delayed even a single additional day, and somewhere beneath all of it, a quiet panic beginning to spread among staff who had never seen their confident, composed chief executive look so completely lost. Engineers argued with one another over conflicting theories, some insisting the fault lay in a recent software update, others convinced a supplier had shipped a defective batch of components, and still others simply staring at their screens in silence, unwilling to offer a guess they could not defend. Amelia called in favors from every consultant she had ever worked with, authorizing spending that would have seemed reckless under any other circumstance, desperate for anyone who could offer even a fragment of an explanation. By 4 in the morning, the exhaustion in the room had curdled into something closer to despair, seasoned engineers rubbing their eyes and admitting, quietly, that they had genuinely run out of ideas. It was in that exhausted silence, with the factory's massive machines standing frozen and useless under the fluorescent lights, that someone finally remembered the strange, quiet man with the old toolbox. He had not been called. Nobody had thought to call him, because nobody believed a man with a rusted toolbox could succeed where a fleet of specialists and an expensive artificial intelligence system had already failed. Daniel did not seek anyone out either, did not offer his help, did not remind anyone of what he had said on his very first day about the machine sounding sick. He simply sat with his coffee, watching the rain streak down the window beside him, patient in a way that seemed almost otherworldly given the chaos unfolding just a few hundred feet away. Word eventually reached Amelia, passed along by a junior technician who remembered the strange, quiet man from the humiliating inspection days earlier, that the former maintenance contractor was still on site, waiting in the break room as though he had known this moment was coming. Desperation has a way of dissolving pride faster than anything else in the world. And by the time Amelia found Daniel sitting quietly with his coffee, she had exhausted every option her considerable resources could offer. She walked into the break room with none of the confidence she usually carried, her tailored blazer wrinkled from a night without sleep, her tablet forgotten somewhere on a desk she no longer cared about. She asked him, in a voice far smaller than the one she had used to mock him days earlier, whether he could help her understand what was happening to her line. Daniel looked up at her for a long moment, studying her face the way he had studied the machines, and then asked a single question in return, wanting to know whether he would have full authority to do whatever needed to be done without interference. Amelia hesitated only briefly before agreeing, too desperate now to care about pride or hierarchy, or the optics of handing control to a man she had ridiculed in front of the entire building. What happened next confused every engineer watching. Daniel did not ask for a laptop. He did not request access to the diagnostic software that had failed to find anything useful all night long. Instead, he walked the length of the production line slowly, placing his palm flat against the machine housings one section at a time, closing his eyes, and listening to sounds that no microphone in the building had been calibrated to detect. He knelt beside one of the main drive shafts and rested his fingers against the metal, feeling for a vibration too subtle for any standard sensor to register as anything more than background noise. He leaned close to certain joints and inhaled, catching the faint scent of overheating lubricant, long before any temperature sensor would have flagged a warning. Within an hour, he announced his conclusion to a room full of specialists who had spent all night failing to reach any conclusion of their own. The problem, he explained, was not electrical, and it was not a software failure buried somewhere in the millions of lines of code running the facility. It was a resonance issue, an almost imperceptible mechanical vibration building up across multiple components in a pattern too subtle for any sensor array to catch, a slow accumulation of stress that had been growing for weeks before finally reaching a breaking point. No diagnostic tool in the building had been designed to measure something so small, so gradual, so entirely dependent on decades of hands-on experience to even recognize as a threat. The specialists from the manufacturer stared at him in silence, some skeptical, some simply stunned that a man with no laptop and no formal credentials on record had identified something their own equipment had missed entirely. Amelia stood at the edge of the group, watching the man she had dismissed just days earlier speak with a quiet authority that no title or degree could manufacture. Daniel returned to his old truck, parked outside, and retrieved the toolbox that had caused so much laughter on his first day, carrying it back through the factory floor as though it weighed nothing at all. Inside were tools that seemed almost absurd next to the digital calibration equipment scattered across the room. A hammer worn smooth from decades of use, a wrench with a handle wrapped in cloth tape, and a mechanical watch he wore, not for fashion, but because its steady ticking helped him time subtle vibrations by feel alone. Amelia watched with an expression somewhere between disbelief and desperation as he began adjusting individual components by hand, tightening some connections by fractions of a turn, and loosening others just as precisely, never once reaching for a replacement part. He worked in near silence, occasionally pressing his palm against a housing to feel whether the vibration had shifted, recalibrating his approach, based on nothing more than decades of accumulated instinct. 3 hours passed in near total silence across the factory floor. The only sound, the rhythmic clinking of Daniel's tools, and the low hum of machinery slowly, gradually, settling into a rhythm no one else had been able to coax from it. When he finally stepped back and asked someone to restart the line, the room held its collective breath as the massive machines shuddered to life once more. This time, there was no shaking, no phantom vibration rattling through the frame, no error codes cascading across the monitors in an endless, meaningless stream. The production line ran smoothly, steadily, exactly as it should have all along, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than any applause could have been. Engineers who had mocked him days earlier stood frozen, unsure whether to feel relief or shame, while Amelia simply stared at the man in his rusted toolbox with an expression she had never worn in front of her staff before. That night, unable to sleep, Amelia sat alone in her office and did something she rarely bothered to do for contract workers, pulling up every record the company had on file for Daniel Brooks. What she found stopped her cold. 20 years earlier, before she had ever set foot in this factory, before she had even finished business school, a young engineer named Daniel Brooks had served as lead designer on the very prototype systems that eventually became the backbone of this production line. He had not simply worked here in some minor capacity. He had helped conceive the fundamental architecture that still ran beneath the surface of every machine on the floor, the same machines that had defeated an army of modern specialists just hours earlier. And then, according to the records, he had walked away entirely, refusing to sell the patents attached to his designs and disappearing from the industry without explanation, leaving behind a legacy that nobody at the company seemed to remember or acknowledge. Amelia read through the old documents late into the night, piecing together a story that painted an entirely different picture of the man she had humiliated in front of dozens of employees. She found early technical drawings bearing his signature, correspondence referencing his refusal of a significant buyout offer. And then, abruptly, nothing at all, as though the company had simply erased him from its own history the moment he stopped being useful in the way they wanted. She sat back in her chair, staring at the glow of her monitor, feeling something she rarely allowed herself to feel in the course of running a $2 billion operation, something uncomfortably close to shame. The man she had ridiculed for carrying an old toolbox had, in fact, built the very foundation her empire stood on, and somewhere along the way, the company had simply forgotten to say thank you. The full picture did not arrive until a retired executive named Robert Hale, one of the founders who had overseen operations decades earlier, reached out to Amelia after hearing rumors of the incident from an old colleague still working at the plant. Robert was in his 70s now, retired to a quiet life outside the city, but he agreed to meet with her, curious to see whether the young woman running his old company had any interest in the truth. Over coffee in a small diner not far from the factory, he told her a story that made her stomach turn, describing how the company had, over the years, absorbed many of Daniel's original innovations into later systems without ever crediting the man who designed them. There had been no lawsuit, no public dispute, no bitter campaign for recognition, because Daniel Brooks had simply chosen to walk away rather than fight a company that no longer valued what he had given it. Robert admitted, with visible discomfort, that leadership at the time had considered it easier to let him disappear quietly than to acknowledge how much of the factory's success had been built on his uncredited work. Amelia asked why Daniel had never spoken up, never sought compensation, never told anyone the truth even when he returned to work at the very facility that had wronged him. Robert shook his head slowly, explaining that some men measure their worth by what they build rather than by what they are given credit for, and that Daniel had always been that kind of man, even in his younger years. He had not stayed silent out of weakness, Robert insisted, but out of a quiet, stubborn integrity that refused to turn his own contribution into a public spectacle or a bargaining chip. For 20 years, Daniel had lived without recognition, raising his son alone after losing his wife, working steady maintenance jobs across the region, never once trading on the knowledge that he alone truly understood these machines from the inside out. Amelia left that meeting with a weight in her chest she had not expected, the beginning of a shame that would follow her long after the coffee had gone cold. Robert also told her something else that night, almost as an afterthought, mentioning that Daniel had once been offered a substantial severance package on the condition that he sign away any future claim to the designs bearing his name, an offer he had refused, not out of greed but out of principle, believing that his work should never have been treated as a transaction in the first place. The old executive admitted, with the kind of candor that only comes late in life, that the company's leadership at the time had considered Daniel difficult precisely because he refused to be bought, and that difficulty had quietly followed him out the door under circumstances nobody wanted documented too carefully. Amelia asked whether any written record of his original contributions still existed anywhere in the company archives, and Robert suggested she check the old engineering vault in the basement of the research building, a room that had not been properly cataloged in years. She spent the following weekend there herself, sorting through boxes of yellowed blueprints and technical notes until she found, tucked inside a folder mislabeled decades earlier, a set of original drawings signed in Daniel's own steady handwriting. Holding those papers in her hands, Amelia understood for the first time just how much of her empire had been quietly built upon a man's forgotten genius. The relief the factory felt after the first crisis proved short-lived, because less than 2 weeks later, a second and far more severe failure tore through the facility without warning. This time, it was not a single line but nearly the entire production floor, a cascading failure that spread from one system to another faster than any team could contain it, threatening to shut down operations for days rather than hours. The foreign specialists who had been retained on standby after the first incident arrived quickly, but within hours they admitted defeat, packing up their equipment and confessing that this failure exceeded anything in their diagnostic playbooks. Amelia stood on the factory floor watching millions of dollars evaporate with every passing minute, and for the first time in her career as chief executive, she did not turn to her algorithms or her dashboards for an answer. She turned instead to the one man who had already proven, once, that some problems could not be solved by machines alone. Daniel arrived within the hour, still carrying the same battered toolbox, and this time nobody in the room laughed. He requested that the entire system be shut down completely, every line, every subsystem, a request far more drastic than anything he had asked for during the first crisis. Amelia did not hesitate this time, did not question his judgment or demand justification the way she once would have, because somewhere over the previous 2 weeks, she had learned to trust the quiet certainty in his voice more than she trusted the endless data streaming across her screens. She gave the order herself, watching as the entire facility went dark and silent for the first time in years, an enormous, expensive gamble resting entirely on the instincts of a man she had once dismissed as a relic. Daniel assembled a small team of maintenance workers, the very people who had always understood him best because they worked with their hands the way he did, and led them through the guts of the machinery with a calm, methodical focus. For 12 straight hours, Daniel worked without rest, moving from one section of the factory to another, diagnosing failures by touch and sound and instinct in places no sensor had ever been designed to reach. He ate almost nothing, drank cup after cup of black coffee brought to him by workers who had begun, almost without realizing it, to treat him with a quiet reverence, usually reserved for people far above his official pay grade. Amelia stayed on site the entire time, refusing to leave despite exhaustion. Watching through the observation windows, as the man worked with a focus that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Somewhere around the 10th hour, she found herself standing beside him on the factory floor, not as his employer but simply as another person hoping desperately for good news, and he glanced at her only once before returning his attention to the machine in front of him. When the final repair was complete, and the command was given to restart the entire system, the silence in the room felt heavier than it had during the first crisis. Every person holding their breath as the machines began, slowly, to hum back to life. At one point during those long hours, a junior technician approached Amelia with a proposal to bring in an entirely new automated diagnostic platform still in development, promising it could theoretically map the kind of resonance failures Daniel had identified during the first crisis. Amelia listened politely, weighed the offer for less than a minute, and then declined, telling the young man that she trusted the hands already working the problem more than she trusted a system that existed only in a slideshow. It was a small decision, but it marked a turning point in the way she led the company from that moment forward. A quiet acknowledgement that data alone had never been enough to save her factory, not once, not either time. Somewhere past midnight, exhaustion finally caught up with Daniel, his hands trembling slightly as he made the final adjustments to a coupling deep inside the machine's frame, and for one brief, terrifying moment, Amelia feared he might collapse before the work was finished. He steadied himself against the housing, took a slow breath, and finished the last connection with the same careful precision he had shown from the very beginning, proving once again that his strength came from somewhere far deeper than simple physical endurance. The moment the production lines settled into their steady, familiar rhythm, a wave of applause broke out across the factory floor, workers cheering in a way that had nothing to do with corporate ceremony and everything to do with genuine relief and gratitude. Amelia stood at the center of it all, watching Daniel Brooks lean against a support beam, exhausted but calm, accepting the gratitude of the workers around him with the same quiet humility he had shown from the very first day. She realized, watching him in that moment, that she had spent weeks measuring the wrong things entirely, judging a man by the condition of his tools rather than the depth of his knowledge, and the realization left her more unsettled than any financial loss the crisis had caused. The factory had survived because of him, twice now. And yet the company had nearly let him walk away without ever understanding what it truly possessed. She knew, standing there in the noise and the relief, that something fundamental about how she ran her company would need to change. 2 days later, Amelia called an all-staff meeting on the factory floor, something she had never done before, preferring memos and dashboards to face-to-face gatherings that felt inefficient by her usual standards. She stood in front of hundreds of employees, including the very engineers who had laughed loudest at Daniel's expense during that first humiliating inspection, and admitted publicly that she had judged a man by his appearance rather than by his ability. She confessed that her obsession with modern technology had blinded her to a kind of expertise that no software could replicate, an expertise built from decades of hands-on experience rather than lines of code. Daniel stood near the back of the crowd, arms crossed, listening quietly. offering nothing more than a small, understanding smile when her eyes found his across the room. Mark Ellison, the young engineer who had made the joke about rusty wrenches, approached Daniel privately after the meeting ended, apologizing with visible discomfort, and Daniel simply shook his hand and told him it was already forgotten. Amelia did not stop at words alone. In the weeks that followed, she commissioned a full review of the factory's technical archives, insisting that every design still in use across the production floor be properly credited to the engineers who had originally conceived it, including, prominently, Daniel Brooks. She authorized a formal correction to the company's internal records, restoring his name to patents and technical documents that had quietly excluded him for 2 decades, a gesture that carried no immediate financial value, but meant more to Daniel than any raise ever could. She also established a mentorship program, pairing veteran maintenance staff with newly hired engineers, insisting that hands-on experience be treated with the same respect as advanced degrees within the company culture going forward. Grace Whitman, the young technician who had spoken with Daniel the night before the first crisis, became one of the program's earliest and most enthusiastic participants, crediting him openly for teaching her to trust her own instincts again. Slowly, deliberately, Amelia began reshaping the culture of the entire company around a lesson she herself had needed to learn the hardest way possible. In the weeks that followed, Amelia found herself seeking Daniel out more often than her role strictly required. First to discuss maintenance schedules and equipment upgrades, then increasingly for reasons that had less to do with the factory and more to do with him as a person. She discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that the quiet man everyone had underestimated possessed a dry, understated sense of humor that could disarm even her most guarded moments. He was thoughtful in ways she had not expected, asking questions about her decisions that revealed a deep intelligence entirely separate from any formal education, and humble in a way that made her own achievements feel, by comparison, loud and unnecessary. For the first time in years, perhaps since long before she had built her company into what it now was, Amelia found herself looking forward to ordinary conversations rather than dreading them as distractions from more important work. Something had shifted between them, subtle and unspoken, growing from mutual respect into something that neither of them rushed to name. Their conversations began to stretch longer than either of them intended, lingering over coffee in the same break room where she had once found him waiting quietly during the worst night of her career. She learned about his late wife, about the years he had spent raising his son alone, about the quiet discipline that had carried him through grief without ever hardening him into bitterness. He learned about the pressure she carried as one of the youngest chief executives in the industry, about the loneliness that came with being surrounded by people who respected her but rarely understood her, about the walls she had built long before she ever met him. Neither of them rushed toward anything, both too aware of the distance their positions had once implied. But the ease between them grew steadily, built not on attraction alone but on a genuine, mutual respect that had been earned rather than assumed. It was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find inside the walls of a factory. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Amelia found Daniel repairing an old bicycle he kept in the maintenance garage. A small, ordinary task he performed simply because he enjoyed working with his hands even when nothing was broken beyond repair. She sat on an overturned crate nearby, watching him work in comfortable silence for a while before admitting, almost hesitantly, that she could not remember the last time she had done anything purely because she enjoyed it, rather than because it advanced some larger goal. Daniel handed her a wrench without a word, gesturing toward a loose bolt on the bicycle frame, and she found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, as she fumbled through a task that came so naturally to him. They spent the next hour talking about nothing important at all, about small memories from childhood, about favorite meals and forgotten hobbies, the kind of conversation that had nothing to do with production quotas or quarterly earnings. Walking back to her car that night, Amelia realized she had smiled more in that single hour than she had in months of boardroom victories, and the realization stayed with her long after she had driven away. Several months after the second crisis, Amelia organized a company gathering to mark the anniversary of the incident that had nearly cost the factory everything, And this time the celebration carried a very different tone than the humiliation that had started it all. She stood before her employees once more, but this time she was not confessing a mistake. She was announcing a promotion, offering Daniel Brooks the newly created position of Chief Reliability Engineer, a role built specifically around the kind of expertise no algorithm could replace. She made it clear to everyone in the room that this decision had nothing to do with sentiment or guilt, but with the simple, undeniable truth that no one else in the company understood these machines the way he did. Daniel accepted the position with a single condition, asking only that his old toolbox remain exactly as it was, untouched and unreplaced, a request Amelia agreed to without hesitation. She told him, in front of everyone, that the toolbox would stay because it served as a permanent reminder that talent does not always announce itself through appearances, and that the most valuable knowledge in any company often belongs to the people least likely to be noticed. The engineers who had once mocked him, including Mark Ellison, approached him one by one over the following weeks, offering apologies that Daniel accepted with the same quiet grace he had shown from the very beginning. The old, battered toolbox was eventually placed inside a glass case in the factory's training center, displayed prominently where every new hire would see it during orientation, a small but permanent symbol of humility, experience, and the kind of skill that could not be taught in a classroom. Months later, the factory reached a level of operational stability it had never achieved before, outperforming every projection Amelia's investors had once demanded from her. Proof that the true engine of the company had never been its software, but the people who understood its machines from the inside out. Amelia and Daniel stood together on the factory floor one quiet afternoon, watching the production lines move in perfect, steady rhythm, the distance that had once separated a chief executive from a maintenance worker now entirely gone. What remained between them was something built slowly and honestly, a mature, unhurried connection grounded in respect rather than convenience, the kind of bond that only forms when two people have truly seen each other at their most vulnerable. As the seasons turned, and the factory settled into a rhythm neither chaos nor crisis could easily disturb again, Amelia often thought back to that first cold morning, when she had laughed at a rusted toolbox without understanding what it truly represented. She had learned, in the most expensive and humbling way possible, that appearances offer no reliable measure of a person's worth, and that the quietest people in any room are sometimes the ones holding everything together. Daniel never spoke of the incident with any bitterness, never used it to claim superiority over the people who had once dismissed him, content instead to let his work speak in whatever language it needed to speak. The factory that had once nearly collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance now stood as a testament to a simpler truth, one written not in code or corporate strategy, but in the steady, patient hands of a man who had never needed anyone's approval to know his own value. Never judge a person by what they carry in their hands. The story seemed to whisper across every quiet, humming machine on that factory floor, but by what they are capable of building when everyone else has already given up. On the first anniversary of that terrible night when the main line had first gone silent, Amelia stood once again beside Daniel in the same break room, where she had once found him waiting calmly with his coffee, while her world fell apart around her. The rain fell softly against the window that evening too, an echo of that first gray autumn morning, though nothing about the two of them standing there felt the same as it had a year earlier. Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, handing her a mug without a word, and she accepted it with a small, easy smile that would have seemed impossible to the woman she had been that first day. Neither of them spoke of titles or hierarchies anymore. The distance between chief executive and maintenance worker long since dissolved into something steadier and far more honest than either had expected to find. Outside the window, the factory hummed on through the evening, its machines running exactly as they should, guided quietly by a man whose worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition, and by a woman who had finally learned to see it.